year, I think they probably more, given that the property has been stores, they probably tried to
Yeah. But I don't think it matters for us either way. No. It seems it's like councils.
Just waiting for one commissioner. Just check I haven't got a text or email from him. Hope he's okay.
Yeah, I was thinking. Can't see.
Any sign? All right. Do you have his number?
Yes.
Cool, thank you. Field trip with Ian has just been too much for him.
Stuck on the side of the brick.
Apologies for being late, Mr. Brown.
You were literally right there.
The
had a
coffee
good
being
evening.
late rather than myself.
You were just following the coffee.
Yeah.
We're in no rush.
As you can tell by me.
We've got a good break this morning.
I've had it for a few days now.
Well, to be fair, mate, there's been a few strange things going on with this process. I don't know if I necessarily would have been that surprised.
Yes, sounds good. Morena Koto, just before we make a start with, I'll call you the further submitters, just for pure ease. With the further submitters, we did a site visit yesterday, went to the Anna Hutchinson land, and just for your benefit and knowledge, we did an earlier site visit as well, where we drove down on both sides of the old Shotover Bridge. We looked at the, not from the road, obviously not in, at the various properties and sections. The Ferry Hotel looked up to the terrace. So yesterday we went to the top terrace and the bottom or the lower terrace, drove round those in a loop, and saw again from that vantage point the looking over the various parcels of land. And then we did the upper terrace as well, so we've done both terraces there. And do note in your, some of the appendices, there are the comments about if we want to visit. We'll see how we go today. We have been there, but if there is thoughts and discussion, we can do that. Then we went to Glen Panel, and we had a look around the front part, and then jumped on a tractor and went up with all health and safety taken care of. Went up, had a look at the top where the reservoirs are proposed, and then we walked around the old homestead area and back out. And then we went to Threepwood, and we went to the dam or the pond that they have up the back of Threepwood along the side, and looked also at the main road into Threepwood and the stormwater type issues and things there. The chair of the Friends came on that as well, so it was the Threepwood and the chair, the Lake Hayes Friends, not generic Friends. So that was our site visit. Unfortunately, through miscommunication, we did not go to Cocoa Ridge, although someone was waiting for us at Cocoa Ridge. So we will endeavour to go to Cocoa Ridge tomorrow, and Linley's just trying to set that up. So we'll get that done tomorrow. So it was definitely for me a very helpful site visit, having a good look around and getting up on Slope Hill, seeing the sort of Te Pūtahi Ladies Mile variation from the other direction, I've found very useful. So that's an update on that. In terms of admin matters, are there any
Don't
particular?
think we have any at this point in time.
Perfect, wonderful. So we'll hand over now to the further submitter team, and over to you. And we have, thank you for pre-circulating submissions, and also we've got Mr. Geddes' evidence. We do have a summary, which we'll ask him to read, but we can start with the submissions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we do that, I also appeared for Ladies Mile, the Pet Lodge Limited.
Oh, yes,
and
yes,
I just wanted to enter a formal appearance on their behalf. obviously we got the communication that you didn't have any questions in relation to the witnesses, and I don't intend to make any submissions in relation to the matter. I think from the submission it was clear what the and the evidence clear what the issues of concern were, and we don't need to take that matter any further. So my name's, sorry, I apologise. My name's Graham Todd. I'm counsel for what I'll call the Spence Road
That's a better name.
further submitters. With me is Mr. Gresson, who's going to present the argument in respect to the jurisdictional issue as to whether or not the primary submission of the Hutchinson Trust is on the plan, on the variation, and then I'll ask Mr. Geddes to present his summary. And behind me is Mr. and Mrs. Arnstead, who are two of the further submitters, and they're local residents in Spence Road, one of the properties that you would have viewed yesterday. So I'll hand over to Mr. Gresson with your leave.
Thank you very much.
Commissioners, I did have copies of the submission if were anyone who needed them, but
These are the 30 November.
that's correct.
Yes, and we have read them, but please, they're not long, but
Well,
the key points especially.
Yes, well, I certainly didn't intend to read them out, and given particularly you've had the benefit of the council's submissions on essentially the same issue and discussions around that, I didn't intend to speak to any particular areas of these submissions, and really just was able to answer questions from the panel in regard to any particular matters that have been raised in it.
Oh, that's excellent, thank you. I do have questions, but we'll start with others. Maybe, Ian, do you have any?
No.
No?
No.
Gillian? Luani?
No.
Huh.
Over to you.
You see, that's the most exciting part, the legal submissions. There we go. And you may, and I explored this with counsel for the council, and you may have heard or listened, and you'll have their submissions, which I've got open here. And the two limbs, and the council's been very clear on its position that this is not within scope.
Yeah.
And you're obviously supportive of that.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and it ties a bit to the evidence, and then we can go back to other questions, is there are the two terraces, the upper terrace, the lower terrace, and certainly from Mr. Geddes' evidence, there was a focus to a degree. I might be wrong, but the way I got the impression was a sort of focus on the lower terrace. Now, obviously, that is the proposal from the trust as the whole, and they've got their evidence on it. But would, from a legal position, you see any difference between an upper terrace only and the lower terrace staying with the Wakatipu Basin? Or do you still think that, and then we'll go through the different requirements, or do you still think that wouldn't achieve the limbs? And starting first with medium density, and then if you could consider it if it was a lower density.
Yes, well, the short answer is I wouldn't say it meets the limbs. There's an issue of whether the extent to which, if you come back to that consequential or incidental test, if you're talking about the lower terrace that represents a more fundamentally different change than the existing notified land, then that's going to be harder to meet that test. And the closer in you get, or the more the land appears to form part of what was notified, you're getting closer to what might be seen as consequential or incidental. So legally, I think in fairness, you could differentiate between the two, but for the reasons that have been set out, we say none of that land on that past that western boundary of the notified area, particularly given the existence of the urban growth boundary, is able to meet it.
And
And I would just add, sorry, regardless in terms of the density, again, the lower density you are, the closer you're getting, but regardless, I would say it's outside the scope.
And on the sort of position of no substantial further section 32, etc., do you see, this isn't what is proposed at the moment, but it potentially might be, and I'm just wanting
Right.
to have it put to you so you can respond. Do you see a difference in the potentially no substantial section 32 again if it's pulled back? So at the moment the council's position is no way, it's same as yours, and also substantial section 32 requirements, and Mr Brown alluded to some of those yesterday. But just wondering whether the 32 might be slightly sort of movable, like what we were talking about before, where it's a scale type approach.
Well, again, there is probably a scale, and you could examine the extent to which further section 32 analysis is required. And again, clearly, the more you move away from the notified analysis, the more further analysis is required. So you would probably move closer on the scale in terms of the upper terrace, but again, I would say that the fact, and under the test that needs to be applied, if you are requiring what is relatively substantial further section 32 analysis, then there's an issue in terms of whether you're in scope of what's notified.
And I haven't taken anything that you've said to be related to this, but again with scale, do you think there is potentially a size element to it too, that there's a proposal that's X and then it becomes Y or something like that might be part of the scale?
Size would come into it. The differences between the land comes into it. Sometimes, if you think of something that's consequential, you might have pieces of land, say within the same site, for example, the same title that might be within what's been notified as part of a plan change, that you might say, well, the inclusion of the entirety of the site is consequential to the what's been notified. Issues in relation to effects on, or whether the adjacent land use is dependent on what the notified land might be used for, those sorts of things. They all form part of what is ultimately a fact-specific assessment of whether what's sought is consequential to the notified zoning.
And moving to the second limb, because discussed it with council for the council, the first limb. Moving to the second limb is the sort of prejudice side of the equation. I noted one of the further submitters said that they got a letter from the property group, but there was an element of surprise is what, and I'm using that word, I'm not sure whether that was the word the court used. I should use the one the court used. Speechless.
Yes.
In terms of the sort of prejudiced or speechless element to it, and again, you have covered it here, but just keen to tease it out a bit more, where do you see that with this particular proposal, given the sort of history, the spatial planning, the knowledge of Te Pūtahi, Ladies Mile, and different developments, etc., and the proposed district plan going through very similar timing?
Yes, well, the history of this process goes to what landowners may or may not have been aware of as a matter of fact, but as a matter of principle in terms of what the RMA requires of zoning proposals in terms of landowners being notified, that issue as a matter of principle exists almost regardless of whether property owners might have been told in some other capacity or become aware of what was happening, because you can never be sure. If a submitter isn't aware, if a would-be submitter isn't aware of it, they wouldn't have obviously made a submission. So there's no real way of being sure that they wouldn't have become part of the process had they known that this area was subject, the status of the land was subject to change. So there's a real issue of, or the fact of not knowing who might have been affected and who might have participated lends itself to determining that to proceed with that proposal and to allow it to be part of the process would create that risk, even if, as is in this case, landowners have become aware and made submissions on it. So it's more of a principled issue, I would say, than was, as a matter of fact, this proposal put to those people.
Chairman, I wonder if I could add two matters to that.
Yep.
I think the mere fact of the description or the naming of the variation comes into play here. People who live here understand what the Ladies' Mile is. So if people start talking about the Ladies' Mile variation or reading about it, you switch off if you think you're not going to be affected by that. That's number one.
Just on that, as not a local, where would you say Ladies' Mile starts and stops? Does it start at the Shotover and stop at Lake Hayes, or is it?
Well, yes, it does,
flat?
because you understand the history of the naming of the Ladies' Mile. I assume that's been covered by during the process, yeah. And so, yes, the Ladies' Mile is known as, is predominantly, historically been referred to as the Straight, and it probably starts more at the Shotover roundabout than it does, because, of course, historically the cutting down to the Shotover Bridge didn't exist, because you went off the Ladies' Mile, down Spence Road and over the bridge, and then back up the other side and onto the Franklin. And you know, when I talk about the history of it, I can still remember that. I remember it because I was left outside, as many young people were, left outside the Ferry Hotel while my parents had a drink inside, and there was a playground across the road from the Ferry Hotel. Anyway, and the second thing I think is important is in terms of the context of surprise or awareness or all of those things is, I can recall when I first took an interest in town and country planning, not resource management. If there's something like this was publicly notified, you would have a map in the local paper showing you exactly where the area is. Times have changed. The descriptions that people now get of a plan change or a variation are totally different to what they used to get in terms of awareness. So I think those two contextual matters are important in relation to understanding the issue of surprise. And some people are more interested than others and take a more or deeper interest, or in fact their representatives who may have acted for them for some time take a greater interest than others and alert people to these things, but otherwise they may not have known about it.
And just picking up on that, because obviously there was an alert here, and do you see that speechless type element of being surprised is across the general sort of public, or who needs to be speechless?
Well, the problem is you don't know. And so that's the difficulty. You could almost say blindness, because in terms of speechless, because we just simply don't know. And people may know now because of publicity and things like that, of articles that have been in the newspaper, but realise it's too late to be part of the process. And so, you know, in terms of that, I think that's important as well.
and ultimately legally it must be looked at from the point of view of the public as opposed to trying to pin down certain landowners, because that's ultimately what the process provides for, is public notification. And people may have interests, geographically you're going to have more, or the proximity factor is going to come into it, but people can be interested in district plan outcomes for all sorts of reasons ultimately, and particularly when we're talking, in this case, there's the Shotover River landscape values that people place importance on. So there's all sorts of factors that come into that.
And we're talking about sort of scale with stage 1 or step 1. Do you think there's a scale potentially as well with the prejudice, that maybe the closer and then the further away, or because of the ONFs, ONLs, etc., that's different here?
I think there would be danger in assuming that, because of that issue of proximity not being the only factor, you couldn't safely assume that if people, the closer you are, if they were notified or made aware, that's less of a concern than if others weren't. I don't think it would be, I don't think you could have that certainty to make that assumption.
Sorry, I'll just look through to check if I've... talked to that sized. No, all my other questions, I think, Mr. Geddes can
Obviously,
address. There might be, yes, please.
yes, obviously in terms of Mr. Geddes' evidence, that's on almost on a without prejudice basis to our argument about the jurisdiction.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, because
yes,
normally
yeah.
we would have a situation where the jurisdictional matters would be resolved first.
Yes.
But I appreciate the
And-
constraints you're working under.
Yeah,
So-
and thank you for there's been various memoranda coming in and things, and yes, absolutely, and the council's very much of the same
Yes.
position and has made that abundantly clear to us, that it's given evidence too, but its fundamental plank
Yes,
is no scope.
yeah. So I'll ask Mr. Geddes to present his summary.
Perfect, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Nicholas Carl Geddes. I prepared a statement of evidence on behalf of the of submitted 55 and further submitters 143 to 147, which we're calling the Spence Road further submitters, and then also further submissions 149 and 150. But as I've set out in my evidence, the submitter 55 and indeed further submitters 149 and 150 have been somewhat the relief has been satisfied as I've set out in my evidence. I have the qualifications and experience set out at paragraphs 1 to 5 of my statement of evidence. In this statement, I provide an update following the planner's joint witness statement of the Friday in relation to my statement of evidence, as well as a summary of what issues remain within my evidence. In terms of the planner's joint witness statement, it accurately records my view that the 2.4 hectares of area identified in figure 4, page 11 of my evidence should remain as lifestyle precinct, subzone of the proposed district plans chapter 24, and not be included as part of the proposed rezoning under the variation as sought by submission 107. The supplementary joint witness planning statement from Werner Murray, dated the 10th of November 2023, confirmed the area referred to in my evidence was to be retained as lifestyle precinct on the submission 107 structure plan, or the revised version of that. I filed a supplementary joint witness planning statement on the 14th of November 2023, confirming this revised submission 107 relief alleviates the unacceptable adverse effects identified in my evidence in relation to the residential privacy amenity, as well as rural amenity values and noise upon those properties owned by further submitters 143 and 147. In terms of my statement of evidence,
putting aside the residential privacy and amenity as well as rural amenity values and noise issue, the only remaining unacceptable effect from the proposed rezoning sought by submission 107, in my opinion, relates to landscape and visual amenity values. My primary evidence was reliant on the expert opinion of landscape architect Mr. Steve Skelton, who considered the rezoning sought by submission 107 would result in moderate to high visual effects, moderate effects on natural character of the subject site, as well as the shot over river ONF or outstanding natural feature. For these reasons, my evidence concluded the rezoning sought by submission 107 would not achieve objective NFL01 and policy NFLP3 of the proposed Otago Regional Policy Statement. Policies 3253 and 3331 of the proposed District Plans Chapter 3, or the Strategic Direction Chapter, as well as Objective 4.2.2b of the proposed District Plans Chapter 4, which is also Urban Development. I have read the landscape evidence of Mr. Tony Milne, dated 20th of October 2023, on behalf of Submitter 107. I disagree with Mr. Milne where he states that the status quo would restrict open rural views that are currently afforded by the extension area. I believe Mr. Milne's position may stem from his reliance on Mr. Ware's theoretical status quo subdivision layout, which depicts 16 rural living allotments across the 12.93 hectare extension area. This number of rural living allotments can only be achieved in the Wakatipu Basin Rural Amenity Zone as a discretionary activity. In my opinion, discretionary activity status should not be relied upon to form a baseline consideration for what is suggested to be the status quo. A more suitable baseline may be 12 rural living allotments in accordance with minimum allotment sizes, yet this does rely on the approval of a restricted discretionary resource consent. I believe the starting point for Mr. Milne's landscape assessment of the rezoning sought by Submitter 107 is incorrect by considering a 16 allotment baseline. For this reason, I prefer the assessment of Mr. Skelton, and reliant on Mr. Skelton's assessment, my opinion remains that the rezoning sought by submission 107 does not achieve the provisions listed above, nor those sections of the RMA referenced in my statement of evidence.
Thank you very much.
That, thank you. I'll take questions.
Wonderful. Just before we go into planning questions, just the legal question obviously around, in effect, whether it's a status quo or permitted baseline. My understanding is it's allowed by a plan or has a resource consent. So if you need a restricted discretionary resource consent, I won't answer the question, I'll ask the question. Is it, in your view, part of the permitted baseline?
No, it's my position based on the Court of Appeal's decision in Hawthorn that at best, in terms of the permitted baseline, you take permitted activities or controlled activities. And in terms of controlled activities, you have to take into consideration what the matters that the council has reserved control over. As far as a restricted discretionary or can I say lower activity status, I don't believe they do form part of the baseline.
And is the idea, the sort of status quo approach, legally, have you come across that or aware of a status quo argument that isn't tied to a permitted baseline?
Only in the sense of it being permitted by a resource consent, that you might have a status quo, but again, no.
Yep. Right. Thank you. I was just, when I was reading those words, just
Yes.
thinking why they might have been used. Thank you. Sorry, panel. Right, questions. Gillian or Puani?
No, I think you may have answered. Mine was on
scale between discretionary and restricted discretionary, and where in there, where would you see the activity being permitted? And I think it was pretty much answered by yourself. So,
Yeah. No, I agree with the sentiments of Mr. Todd in that regard.
You do?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I do acknowledge that in my evidence. I've looked to the restricted discretionary activity as being a pseudo expectation of what might occur on the site, but that is actually based a little more beyond the permitted baseline consideration to my experience with consenting, as I've set out under that restricted discretionary activity, and what I would expect would be a reasonable outcome to be achieved on that particular part of the site. So that speculation is my own, and it is...
I think that's why the word status quo is being used. I think it's a fair reflection based on your experience.
I guess it's also often joined to a starting point, at least for an assessment purposes, and without that starting point, the rest becomes somewhat, extremely difficult at best. So that's been my starting point, might be a better way of putting it.
and with the plan change not being in place, there's no support for it really under the policies and objectives. Would that be your position?
Depends what you mean. You mean plan variation that we're currently hearing, or the plan change with respect to the Wakatipi Basin? Because in terms of the Wakatipi Basin, we do have the court's final decision on the framework of that, and we are processing and improving consents under that framework, noting that there are still several outstanding appeals, but those are site-specific appeals, and they seek site-specific relief. So they will not have the jurisdiction to alter the overall framework. And if you were to proposition a resource consent for the Hutchison land, then that would enjoy being processed under that main framework. Yeah. So it does have the Wakatipi Basin, the lifestyle precinct does have that status as an operative zoning for that site.
And that question was going to the existing planning framework, and I think
That's
it answered
right.
that question.
Yeah. Yep.
No, I'm good, thanks.
Thanks, Gordon. Judith?
I do have a couple of questions, and it is around your sort of assessment of what might be a reasonable outcome for that site in terms of getting 12 rural lifestyle dwellings. Are you aware of what the setback, whether there is a setback requirement from the edge of the terraces for those dwellings might be?
For the dwellings that would be rural living dwellings, as if a resource consent was processed, 10 metres from the legal boundary is the setback. But I think also, as a planner, you need to consider the framework for the restricted discretionary resource consent under Rule 2759, which expects that platforms will not be on the edge of a terrace, and there's a number of assessment matters through the Chapter 24 objective and policy set in relation to visibility. So I wouldn't expect that you would be simply measuring a 10 metre off the legal boundary and populating it with a building platform. I think the acceptable outcome under that framework would see the building platform set back considerably from the escarpment edge and towards the toe of the I guess we could call it the second escarpment feature that would be behind the lower terrace, to the east of the lower terrace.
And in your opinion, is that to protect the views from the river up?
Both the views from public places, but then also to respect the O&L feature which lies on the other side of the road.
Sorry, just which rule were you referring to? I'm not sure.
2759?
2759.
Yeah, that would be the general subdivision and development framework for the restricted discretionary pathway. Yep.
And in terms of the upper terrace, I assume there's the same setback rule and the same assessment criteria, but in your opinion, how far back from the edge of that upper terrace might you need to be to reach the outcome that the subdivision rules are trying to get to?
It's a little difficult to speculate, because in proffering a resource consent I would be reliant on my landscape opinion in that regard. There would also be a geotechnical consideration, as I've found with shot over country, that there are requisite setbacks in the engineering terms, which can often be further, if you like, than some of the landscape ones. So that I would find a little difficult to answer. In terms of setbacks, though, we have to be mindful that there is a 75-metre expectation from the road boundary at the top. So, yeah, it might become a fine line.
So that could actually squeeze development down to quite a small zone through the middle. If you've got 75 metres from the road, 10 metres minimum from your sort of front face of your, what would assume would be the new lot boundary.
Yep.
In a subdivision situation,
Yep,
then allowing for your consideration of visibility.
that's right. Yep.
Yep.
That's not uncommon in the basin, and that's why I suggest that in my evidence you do have to have a comprehensive and landscape-led approach to subdividing in accordance with the Chapter 24.
So just exploring and putting scope aside,
Yeah.
so I'm not a lawyer, but putting that scope question aside, if we were to consider that inclusion of the Anna Hutchinson Family Trust land into the variation was appropriate, in terms of outcome, if the same setbacks from the property boundary on the riverside were applied and the same assessment criteria to manage visibility from the ONL and the public places were also applied, how would you view that as an outcome in terms of comparability with the current situation and what you could reasonably expect to be developed on that site?
Yeah, I would be cautious about cutting the inextricable link between the setbacks and the actual outcome that comes with. That expects a minimum lot size of 1 hectare and 75 metre setback and a 10 metre setback. I don't think you can simply substitute, what area remains and then make it medium density and expect that achieves an outcome which is remotely anticipated by the Chapter 24 framework. No.
So that's from a planning perspective, and I'm maybe asking you to speculate outside of your expertise.
Excellent.
So I might have to filter this one. I'm an engineer.
Yep.
I'll be upfront about that. So what I'm trying to understand is if you have a set of controls in the district plan that limit where you can build on this land anyway, and you have a set of assessment criteria that are seeking to get to a particular outcome in terms of what you can see from public places and pushing development into an area where it's less visible or potentially not visible from the public spaces. If you then put more buildings in that dead zone from a visibility perspective, does it make a difference?
Yes.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
We're at a rezoning level, so we're considering setbacks and the density of living. So it's not necessarily that the assessment criteria that you may apply to a resource consent should be employed, because I guess in making a resource consent in the Chapter 24 framework, it doesn't expect a low density outcome. So taking a few steps back in terms of a rezoning approach, I think that you're considering everything on the round, and you wouldn't be able to just adopt a 75 metre setback. If you could, that would make planning incredibly easy, but no, would be my opinion. And that might be supported better through landscape reasons and one in particular.
Thank you. It's been very helpful.
Thank you. Julian?
Nothing from me.
Ian?
Okay. maybe to a combination of yourself and Mr. Todd too. I haven't quite got my head around the link between Hawthorn, which I thought was a resource consent-based decision, and a plan change, and restricted discretionary consents that may need consents in other chapters of the plan, transport, earthworks, maybe there's an NES for soil contaminants trigger somewhere, and how we make the link between a permitted baseline and a very confined, very tightly bound analytical correction as part of a resource consent, specifically so as to not double count or double dip effects. And this question of status quo for a plan evaluation, which feels like it uses different language and feels like it's a necessarily fuzzier kind of judgment. And I think you've talked about reasonableness and how you landed where you did. And the question, I guess, is, in all fairness, why are we even talking about the permitted baseline? Is it just I haven't been convinced there's anything that's actually permitted that's relevant to the issues we're talking about. And if that's the case, what is the correct language to describe this exercise of probing a status quo versus something that's not a status quo? Is it just a planning judgment that we just accept is full of all sorts of contingent uncertainties, and it's just the best we can do?
Yep. Yes is the simple answer for me. And that's why I use the word speculation, and that speculation is my own, Commissioner Munro.
Yep. Yeah, I know that's come through in your evidence, and the reasoning why you've preferred one landscape approach after the other with your own.
And in preparing that, I think it was almost taking a step towards some level of advocacy and trying to find what might be a solution between the parties.
Yeah.
So, and back to, if I'm able to comment, and Graham can correct me if I've got this wrong, in terms of the permitted baseline, yes, it was an appeal based on a consent, but I think it's almost one and the same if you're considering a rezoning in a status quo scenario.
Well, hold on. It's one thing to meticulously map every one of 5,000 rules in every planning document on one site.
Agreed.
Very different to do it across 100 sites.
Yep.
And an applicant is proposing something, normally in a resource consent.
Yep.
Not 50 people imagining 50 different things on 50 different
Can't
sites.
disagree. But back to considering permitted and then controlled and then restricted discretionary and what's enabled by consent. In my opinion, that's what we are considering when we are even at a rezoning level, is what's permitted by the consent on the property.
Or what might be authorised based on what might be granted by potential consents that might be applied for.
That's a lot of mites.
Yeah, I was about to say the same.
That's why I've just stated before, I'm speculating when I say that how I've got there. But if we strip it back and I was to put in front of you a rezoning, a full rezoning package, then I wouldn't be speculating.
Yes, no, that's partly understood. But yes, anyway, thank you.
And if I can clarify, I was responding to a question. I wasn't putting up a proposition.
Very good, very good. I think for me, and your summary is just a summary, but in a funny way, it's in your paragraph 9, and it's that blurring of the lines. Then you haven't said permitted baseline, but you've used the word baseline, and I wonder whether a better word might just be starting. A starting consideration.
That's exactly,
that was where,
that's what I was saying before. I think starting point's probably a better
I think
expression.
That makes it crystal clear, I think.
Yeah, I think, Commissioner, if you have a zoning which creates an expectation, maybe, from this, if you starting, that there's going to be something that's going to go there.
Yep.
I think that's as far as you can actually take it, really.
Almost like a
but
contextual thing.
what it actually, the particulars, you don't know because of all of the mites that you referred to before.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make that, and I've been reflecting on it with the landscape evidence because of the particulars, you don't know where a building might go or how reflective the roof might be, or all of those things that then have to somehow be figured out in the context of what impact on a view might be. And it does become immensely speculative from whichever side one is coming from.
That's right, and I think In a way, to reduce that speculation, I've probably escaped to note that there are some good characteristics of the site that does make it in the lifestyle precinct zone. So it's not in the Wakatipu Basin Rural Amenity Zone with an 80 hectare minimum. So, yeah, as Graham suggests, there is an expectation there, and I felt it appropriate to speculate to arrive at what I had there.
Look, I think in all fairness to you, I think it's fair to acknowledge a bit of credit in what you've done. I think you could have possibly gone the other way and said we should only be looking at what's literally on the land right now, and everything else is too hard.
Might have been a safer
and I
bet,
think it's worth recognising you've actually really made that brave leap to try and fill that gap, and
Appreciate
it
it.
certainly is very helpful for me. So thank you. That's all.
And then just picking up on that in terms of the particulars you do not know, and this is back then to a legal argument and my questions earlier about Section 32.
Yeah.
Is there a link between the particulars you do not know and sorry, this isn't for you so much, Mr. Geddes, and the legal requirements in terms of...
Because that's where the Section 32 analysis teases out the particulars and gives you the benefit of knowledge, which you don't have with respect, and subject to the evidence that you're going to hear. But I still don't think you've got it. And so that makes your task all the more difficult, I would have thought. And that's why I would accept Mr. Brown's position that he took, that, look, if this is going to happen, it's got to go through a separate process, and there's nothing that's going to prevent that process happening. It's unfortunate that my clients or our clients might have to be involved in another process, but that's unfortunately the logical step, and that's the danger of, and which was recognised in the cases that Mr. Gresson referred to in our submissions, that the danger if you take that jump without having gone through that exercise, it could come horribly unstuck for you down the track. Because then you really do create an expectation.
Can I ask another question?
Oh, yep.
Mr. Geddes, just the prospect of a separate plan change exercise for the Hutchinson land. You may not be able to answer this because your brief has been to look very much at the Hutchinson land, not necessarily the rest of the proposed rezoning. Do you have a sense of comfort that you understand the extent of what has been proposed for rezoning further on down the mile?
So you're, in terms of Section 32 expectations
Just
for the wider zone?
what the council has proposed to rezone, the zones that are proposed, where the centre is.
Yep,
You've got a sense of comfort if I asked you a question about that?
absolutely not.
No? Well, that's fine, then I won't.
I have no comfort.
Very good, fair.
Back to the inner Hutchinson land.
Have I got comfort in answering your question about comments on the wider zone? Or
Yes.
have I got comfort that
No, I
the
was asking,
rezoning's heading in the right
are you
direction?
aware of it? And if I ask you a
Yes, I
question-
am. Yes,
Okay. All right.
yeah, sorry,
All right.
Commissioner Munro.
All
yeah.
right.
No,
You're a difficult fish to catch.
yeah.
All right, the question is this. If there was a future plan change for the Hutchinson land,
Yep.
on the basis that the rezoning proposed by the council within the Ladies Mile Zone, there or thereabouts, was approved as it is and as you understand it, would it be possible for the Hutchinson land to be rezoned as a discrete add-on? Or, in your view of how the zone works, would one be obliged to then start also replan changing part of the plan change area for things like, should there be a separate centre, should the roads change, should the structure plan change? Are they hugely interdependent? Or, as I said at the start, could the Hutchinson land conceivably just be a discrete add-on?
Currently, I don't think it's a discrete add-on.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think, though, that the Ladies Mile zone, should it become a zone, an operative zone,
Yep.
would remain, or would be intended to be a museum piece and remain static. So on that basis, I would have had to think that at some point, reasonably, there must be contemplation of how it might be able to be extended, should there be a desire for that.
So if, and this is not about what's fair or unfair, it's just understanding the technical parameters of what would be required. If the Hutchinson land was then to be considered for a plan change, let's assume the council beneficially decided it would do it as a public plan change. Is it your view that the scope, the area of that plan change wouldn't be just confined to the Hutchinson land? It would need to include whatever bit of the current Ladies Mile zone to be rezoned through whatever exercise figured out those interconnections?
The later, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Geddes.
No problem.
Just one extra question from me, because that was very helpful discussion, is just we've heard evidence from the council's team on the Anna Hutchinson site being a sort of a good site for residential development from the economics perspective, potentially the upper terrace from an urban design perspective, but from a housing need, the economic position is this is a sort of not quite a no-brainer location, but a good location for growth and the need for housing in Queenstown. On that basis, and this is all hypothetical given scope, but on that basis, your evidence, and then there's been changes in terms of the lower terrace, but moving up to the upper terrace, would that sort of need for housing and economic justification, and in fairness, you won't have been listening to things and that kind of stuff, but from your planning perspective, would that alter anything in terms of setting aside scope, but the reasonableness justification for some change at that upper level, maybe even not medium density, but the more Ladies Mile low density? So sorry, there's a few questions,
yeah,
but I was just shaping it.
No,
So
that's fine. I think it always becomes a question of how, at what higher level you can find, or not necessarily generate, but you can find some credence to some maybe national or larger directives to provide or meet a desire. But I think the question has to be, are you that high that you've actually lost sight of the ground, in terms of the ground being, there is under that a lot of other tests that do have to be met, and those might be locational and those might be contextual. And I think whilst I can tend to align myself with those higher level considerations, I can't agree that the slightly lower tests in terms of its contextual fit are for a higher density.
And just before I ask you one question, what about a lower density? That sort of Ladies Mile low density. So the southern side of State Highway 6 is low density, areas H2, H1, etc. Just flipping that onto the northern side and setting aside all the scope and the symmetry and all the connectivity, etc.
Yeah. I guess my concern with that, in terms of when you're starting to whittle down to a lower density, is it still meeting your higher level expectations? Probably not. Also, I think when you start to get small pockets of low density residential, having spent the last couple of years sitting in the courtroom deliberating over interspersed areas of the Wakatipu Basin and the propensity to locate rural living areas, I would be concerned that if you were to award the property with a pocket of rural living, a pocket of low density residential, you could well be opening the floodgates for the rest of the Wakatipu Basin to enjoy the same.
I'll come back, I'll follow up on that one, because that then comes to this concept we've heard about a bit, about a defendable boundary.
Sure.
as a planner, from your position, if there was to be some form of development within the Anna Hutchinson Trust land, the council's position is the defendable boundaries further up, and that's part of their factual argument, not their scope argument. Are you familiar with the I take it you probably are, the defendable boundary? In fact, you might mention it in your evidence.
No,
But
yeah.
do you see, when you're talking about it potentially then flowing, I'd say northwards up the Shotover, do you think there's a defendable boundary there?
No.
And what would be the key reasons for that answer?
Well, noting that some boundaries are, I guess you could say, less geomorphological and more arbitrary. A lot of the arbitrary boundaries in the basin have been boundaries for a long time, so by way of occupation, they've become defendable. And so that really falls to the creation of new boundaries to have that primary, I guess, step towards having a geomorphological feature as being a defence in landscape terms. And again, I'm way over the fence and out into the area that I shouldn't be. But yeah, that's my understanding. And so I wouldn't, from my expert opinion of not being an expert on landscape things, see a defendable boundary there. I think if you were to at least be creating a zone there at some point in the future, if that was acceptable, with all the mights and maybes, you could perhaps potentially reinforce a boundary with a treatment that by way of occupation could be accepted in the future. But I do not know, and I would not want to comment whether that would be a defensible boundary.
And then just going back to your comment before, the joys of economists, you can be at the high level, you might lose touch with the locational and contextual elements. So yes, the economists are of course looking at growth, housing, demand, supply, etc. Do you see, again, those locational and contextual elements, and this might be more a legal one, but from a planning sense, as also relevant to a Section 32 assessment?
Absolutely, because one of those is the Section 6 matter in relation to the outstanding natural feature. So I'm not, by levelling in terms of describing it from a higher level to slightly lower, it's not taking the sting out of the test. And there is some quite fundamental tests there that do rely on contextual circumstances, and that's where I think the difficulty in that rezoning is. But again, I don't think that's one that can't necessarily be contemplated from a first principles point of view, and in my view it wouldn't have been done on a first principles basis, otherwise it would have been notified as an area.
And just finally, from your position, and as I've taken it, and you've been very open and helpful, is that it's not per se no development, especially when we're talking about the upper terrace. It's just at the moment there's too many unknowns and therefore uncertainties and therefore questions that as a planner you would expect to see assessed and to have been developed through.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's, in short, just a little late in the piece.
Thank you. Any additional questions? No? No?
Yeah, just one last one.
It's like the sort of at an auction. Going.
He's a difficult fish to catch, isn't
He keeps thinking.
Yeah.
Despite
I can relate to that.
not to. Your thoughts on one final topic, this issue of awareness, knowledge.
Yes.
One of the arguments that has been made by various council witnesses, and I'm not going to suggest it's one of their principal arguments, but more of a secondary supporting thing that's come up, hasn't just been this plan change. We've been told all about this other master plan that everybody knew about. And then there was a spatial plan that everybody knew about. And this is just the logical end piece of what has been a huge process of more or less continuous thinking. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is it really realistic that people didn't know what was happening here in light of what we're being told is a huge concerted multi-year effort?
When
And
you
I
say-
appreciate there's a resource management technicality that may be the specific issue you're focusing on and the rights that come with that, but more generally just in a wider sense of awareness of something going on here that might have included the Hutchinson land. Do you think those wider exercises are relevant or just not at all?
I think the wider exercises are relevant in a planning sense in terms of when you're coming to proffer your Section 32 assessment, you know, it greatly assists to have some prior thoughts, a long lead-in, and yet again that wouldn't necessarily overcome all the issues that may be in front of you. At the end of the day, if it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea. But to put the Hutchinson submission in the same boat, I find is very difficult because it was a submission on, and as you'll probably, if I could draw upon my memo, by putting a submission in on a master planned and a long entry into a process, it doesn't necessarily come with the support of that long entry and detailed analysis. And then also in a process, it would be my opinion that it puts a third party assessment or people being aware of it on the back foot from the get-go. So they may have been to the master planning, they may have been involved in the long line process, and then someone turns around and whacks a submission in.
So it's your view that no one would have reasonably imagined that someone not in the council's identified area might submit asking to also be in it?
I don't think it would be out of the realms of possibility, but that would be my opinion, and it would be very different in terms of a member of the public to understand the process. And then I would add that it may seem a big process and it may seem wide-ranging, but in Queenstown we have 3 of those going on at the moment, and we're, like I say, we're just spending some time in the court to get one chapter settled for the Wakatipu Basin. We're in our 3rd stage of a plan review, and then we've got spatial planning exercises through other desires, and we've got national statements coming out. I don't think there's a year that goes past where we haven't got 2 of them, at least. It's a busy little place, and then somewhere in the middle, people are trying to go to work and concentrate on living, and then they're expected to understand all this stuff that we struggle with, which I think is very difficult.
We often hear the argument in this community about fatigue, planning fatigue.
It's not just here, you'll be...
No, I appreciate that, but in a situation such as this, and the other thing you need to consider here is the very large proportion of absentee owners, that it's not a typical community that you might have elsewhere where
I've done previous work in Thames Coromandel, which has very similar, in some cases, very high rates of absentee owners. So absolutely appreciate that,
thank
that
you.
argument. Thank you for that. I promise nothing else.
No, I've now thought of a few things. Sorry, the
right.
the defendable edge wasn't you. It was in Mr.
No.
and Mrs. Cole Bailey's summary. So that's where I
Yep.
thought I'd read it somewhere.
Yeah,
You helpfully attached, and you've just mentioned it, the Environment Court's consent order, I think it was. Oh no, final decision of the Environment Court for the Wakatipu Basin. I noticed, and you allude to it, which is why I noticed it, but within Chapter 27, that 27.518, there's a capacity for sites to sort of accommodate more development. And I was just wondering if you could help me in which of those LCUs is the Anna Hutchinson? I'm trying to remember, and I don't have their evidence with me.
yeah.
Nor
It's, so 27.5.18.
A.
Yeah.
I'm disturbed that you're looking into your mind rather than to paper.
I haven't got it attached, but we have been working on it for a while. In terms of the LCUs, I think it's on the shot over River Terraces LCU.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it,
There would be a description in the LCU for a capacity rating. And I'm not going to tell you off the top of my head what it is because I can't remember, but I suspect it's probably moderate.
do you mind just looking and just letting the
I can do that.
panel
Yeah.
But again, this is similar to setbacks and what density within, because
Yep.
I think it's a quantum leap to go from reading an LCU that's for a rural living area and to have a high capacity to absorb that type of development to suddenly go high density residential. Yeah.
But that's
Yeah,
a,
but
a
I
very
will
fair
check
point.
the LCU rating and I can revert civilly with that if you like. Yeah.
Thank you, and I'll just check, I mean, you can't really answer to the different appendices. Thank you for all the photos as well from
No
the
problem.
We believe the answer's, it's in LCU 7.
Seven.
Mr.
Thank you.
Skelton's rebuttal evidence
Yeah.
deals with
That's,
the
I knew I'd
capacity.
seen it
Yeah.
somewhere.
And what's the rating for it?
It's moderate high.
Moderate height, yeah.
But Mr. Skelton's rebuttal evidence deals with
Yep.
his views on that too.
I knew I'd seen a
Fantastic.
discussion on it, and then I was just trying to work
Yeah.
out where.
That's
Thank
the
you.
map there.
Perfect. Yes, so thank you very much for the photos as well. They're very useful. No further questions from me, so thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you very
Thank
much, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you.
Good luck with your deliberations.
Thank you. Well, we'll now adjourn, thanks to Mr. Todd and his earlier clients. So we've got a break now and we'll be back at I should check, make sure I'm right. We'll be back at 1:30 with the Corona Trust.
You had indicated yesterday
Oh,
perhaps there might be some more
actually,
questions.
sorry, I'm
Mr.
getting
Brown.
slightly ahead of myself. I've thought overnight, it becomes a bit chicken and egg about asking questions in anticipation of submissions and things. But I've been thinking, should I bother, shouldn't I bother? The one question, and it's more something to think about, and I'll explore it this afternoon, no doubt with thank you very much, Mr. Giddens, Rick Giddens, is just the policies about maintain the amenity, privacy, etc. at the boundaries, and how that policy fits in, and you might be able to explain it now, with potentially other policies and the higher order objectives. Because my one concern is just focusing on one policy, and I'm just would be interested, and this might be putting you on the spot, and we could do it at 1:30, just have a few minutes if you wanted, Mr. Brown. But there's the focus for the Corona Trust, who we'll hear from next. There's that specific sort of maintain, and in the various responses, Mr. Brown, you're happy with what the council's proposing is maintaining, but I was just interested in your view of the wider, rather than a myopic single policy and a whole plan, whether there's wider sort of relevant provisions there too that we haven't been flagged.
Which was the, just remind me.
Sorry.
what was the policy?
I'll just get, and this is a good test of my system that's about to fail.
49, I think it's 49.2.7.8,
That's sounding good. Let's go to that one.
which is in the low density residential precinct,
That will be it.
ensure that the height, bulk and location of development maintains a low density suburban character and maintains the amenity values enjoyed by users of neighbouring properties, in particular privacy and access to sunlight.
Correct.
So,
I took your, and it might have been your rebuttal or one of the comments to the questions,
yes,
as you're comfortable with that policy with the council's proposed setbacks, etc.
yes,
But what I was interested in is how does that policy sit under the objective and with other policies? Just because maintains can be argued sometimes to be, well, you're maintaining, in effect, what is here now, having had the discussion about the status quo or the existing environment, and just whether the other policies and the other objectives might help the sort of thinking about what is being maintained and in what way. Sorry, I'm maybe not expressing it clearly.
No, I understand. So, well, the objective that is serving, that particular policy is serving, is an attractive, although we've agreed we're going to delete that word, built environment that positively responds to streets and open spaces, provides a high level of residential and neighbourhood amenity, achieves high quality urban design and ecological outcomes, and incorporates Indigenous biodiversity in design. And then there's various policies about integrating design with public spaces and a pedestrian-friendly environment, set-tiered cultural heritage, mana whenua values, and then there's a policy about lighting, there's a policy about outdoor storage and car parking, and 49276 is about activities sensitive to road noise, and then there's a policy about accessibility, and then there's the policy I just read out before, which is about the maintaining amenity values. So bringing in the conversation we've just been having, or you've just been having about permitted baseline, there is the Cocoa Ridges consented development, which has setbacks, big building platforms, and we've simply adopted a let's maintain those standards. There could be more density on the Cocoa Ridge land, but recalling Michael Lowe's evidence, there's not a great deal more building mass. Length.
Yep.
Because we're maintaining the same height as well. So same height, same setbacks. There's not a great deal more in terms of building mass and length than what would otherwise be the case. So therefore, there's not really a great deal of difference. Therefore, we're achieving the word maintain.
That's helpful, thank you. I was just, because it's got that maintains the amenity values enjoyed, and yes, there's the different pictures of the different options and plans that we'll go through this afternoon, no doubt. But I was just wanting clarity, because really the objective and those other policies you read out don't really help. It sort of suddenly sits alone on its own. No one submitted, so Mr. Giddens is right in that respect.
Yes.
But it's just how, when I read, and you've kept that position, that it's maintaining with the council's provisions, and just wanted to understand that, and no, that's helpful, thank you.
Thanks.
I just also flag that I'm not going to attend. Ms. Woods and I will tag team some of the submitter appearances. So
absolutely fine
it's
and understood.
Panel.
Yeah, very.
Can I also
understood.
just clarify
Yes,
one thing,
please.
because I also did a site visit last night because I went for a bike ride and found myself actively using active trail links, which was very good, but then I got stuck in the rain. While I was just going up and down Lower Shotover Road with the Ladies Mile land on the right and the Hutchison land on the left and the cemetery. And then I went back and reread all the evidence. So one thing I will express is, which is an update from yesterday, is that I'm satisfied that you would have enough evidence from them to make whatever call you'd like to make. So the issue then is the difference between what their experts are saying and what the council experts are saying, and in particular the fact that there's disagreement between the council experts, between the traffic issues about low density on the one hand, and then the economics difference was between if it's low density it's fine, but if it's medium density it's not, because there's economic repercussions down the track. So it's just one thing I'd like to flag with you. The other thing is we had an exchange about the western boundary of the Ladies Mile Zone and why it was decided to end it there. There's I spent a bit of time looking at it from, I think it's called Springvale Road, which is just a narrow private road that goes off to the east and then north from Lower Shotover Road, immediately adjacent to the north boundary of the western end of our zone, of the Ladies Mile Zone. There's a clear topographical distinction there, because if you're on that road, you're on the rise above the flat land, the plain of Ladies Mile. Then there's the road, and then of course there's the cemetery, which is a pretty clear geographical point. So those factors all led to the council's decision, the master planners, to decide that was where the logical boundary would be of the zone. Now, having said that, if we go a whole further afield and we're looking at terraces and things, and then we push north, which is what Mr. Milne had done in his discussion in the landscape evidence, there's appropriateness for urban, subject to where it might end on the north side, on both sides of the road, because it seems to me that their new line on the eastern side of Lower Shotover Road seems a bit arbitrary. That doesn't seem to follow anything geographical. And then it just comes down to if that extension was there, what is it going to be? Yeah, and there's competing evidence on that. And then finally, on that point, I'm having looked at the structure plan. I think I'm comfortable that you can make a call on the Ladies Mile Zone in its own right, in the structure with the structure plan, with the roading in its place, and then any new extension, whether you decide to add it now or whether it comes along with a subsequent variation down the track somewhere, whatever process that might take, would integrate in one way or another. Yeah, so I don't think there's contrary to what Mr. Geddes' response, I don't think there's such an issue that it would imperil you making decisions at the western end of Ladies Mile now.
Thanks, Mr. Brown. That's unexpected, but very helpful and timely in terms of at least what's churning in my head. And one of the things I was pondering on our site visit yesterday, and without having any knowledge of what the submitter might actually come and say they want, it did occur to me that one scenario, and there are many, with and without Hutchinson, but one is a lower density suburban type outcome, possibly the upper terrace, and the chair put a question along those lines to Mr. Geddes just previously. Partly on the premise that the lower density suburban can't of itself be fundamentally antagonistic to what the zone seeks, because the council itself is proposing lower density type outcomes as part of its own zone within the objectives and policies framework. So we can't just say fundamentally it has to be medium density or higher or it's out, because that's not what plan changes. So there's a little bit of theoretical wiggle room, and a lower density outcome might alleviate potential concerns for severity and change, might almost have a compatibility with the suburban type development at the top of the Quail Rise side of the ONF that I could see from the top tier. And it might alleviate this question of, do we need to relitigate the existing western part of the Ladies Mile Zone about needing new centres and other things, if in fact a compatible but slightly lower density might not require a whole rethink. It might actually become more of a compatibility an add-on that maybe doesn't tip the scales too much. And that's one part of the calculus that's working through as we did our site visit. And I'm interested in the comments you've just made about there could be a way of compatibly fitting it in. And now, notwithstanding the work that was done to date by the council team about what it might mean and what the submitter wants and new centres and so on, would something like I've just put to you, and this is very hypothetical, and again, we don't know if the submitter might come in and say, outrageous, we want high density. But would that scenario, and for the reasons I just put to you that occurred to me, would that be the kind of thing that you might see as one part of how it could fit in terms of what you've been thinking about, or is that still quite separate or very different?
But for the traffic effects, because
Yes.
I'm sure if you put that to Mr. Shields, he would say, no, that wouldn't
Yes.
be acceptable, because we're just creating a whole lot of vehicle-oriented development
Yes.
that is not within the walkable distances
Yes.
of things. So,
Yes, no, we've had quite a discussion with him on
Mm.
why is it okay for stuff on the south side to not be subject to the same tests, and we'll consider how far we take as responses in that respect.
Yeah.
But absolutely appreciate, as you say, there's not entire agreement in the council team of how it might work, but that's really, really helpful. But as I say, it all might be a discussion of theory that's unrelated to what the submitter might actually ask for.
Indeed.
Thanks, Mr. Brown.
No. Before I ask anything, any questions from anyone? Just two things, and I'm trying to remember my track of mind from that one. I've forgotten one of them already. Oh, one of them actually, and it's more a legal one, but is this discussion we're having, and I realise we haven't had the submitter yet, but your view as a planner that the discussion we're having, is this the type of discussion that you'd be used to having through a Section 32 process?
Yes, indeed.
And the other one is, you mentioned you're satisfied on the evidence, sorry, the first point, and I was trying to write it down, then you carried on, then I lost it, and I lost writing it down as well. Do you mind just repeating for me your first point?
Oh, right. So it was just, I was just clarifying the exchange we had yesterday was whether I thought that the submitter's evidence was deficient, but I don't. It's very comprehensive. They've got master plan, they've got landscape, they've got traffic, they've got planning. There's a sort of a nominal Section 32 involved. So I think, I think there's enough there of good information for you to make a call. So I was just making sure that that's. But so then it goes to the other question you asked me: is it then a matter of just the difference of opinions between all of the experts, and that's what it's landing on.
Yep. But you're not saying that their evidence ticks all the Section 32 requirements as if it had been, there's still outstanding matters that would need assessment, the mere fact we've been having these discussions, or you're now comfortable that actually, should get the legal side of it, but from the legal position of the sort of Section 32 justification, noting timing?
I think there are still some questions on the likes of the heritage, for instance,
Yep.
and the ecology in particular.
Yep.
I think what Mr. Brown's saying with respect to the evidence that they have provided.
Cool. I just wanted to be really clear so I didn't merge the two in my mind. That's great. Thank you. But it was just when you said it, I was like, whoa, wait on.
Right, sorry, yes.
No, that's great. Okay, no further questions from me. Anything else admin-wise? Otherwise, we'll adjourn until 1:30. Thank you for reminding me too that we had Mr. Brown. Thank you.